Art has always been a part of our culture for as long as we've been around. Although everyone's view on art is different, artists still bring culture into their creative process. You can't have one without the other. They reflect the feelings of people and their experiences. It helps us reflect on the past along with understanding today. Art helps us understand our own culture and the culture of others. There's a very strong relationship between art and culture. So now we can start. So do you want to introduce yourself a little? Who you are, what you do?
Yeah, my name's Conrad Armstrong. I'm a artist and teacher. I was born in Kenya and lived there for 10 years, then spent the next 16 years of my life in the US, and then moved here in 2004.
So you've been here quite a while.
I've been here a long time. I'm not sure if my math is exactly right, but I'm 40 years old now. And yeah, I teach art at an international school, Prague British International School.
Oh.
And I also work at Vysoká škola umělecké průmyslové, which is where I met Artem and Takeshi, who you also interviewed. And I'm currently the tutor of the master's program there as well. So I'm working with teenagers and young adults, I would say. And I also have experience working with little kids and older people as well.
So do you want to say a little about your art, what you usually do, what you prefer to work with?
I am primarily I use drawing and painting as my main mediums, but my experience studying art here at Umprum encouraged me to experiment with different media as well. So over the years I've done sculpture and performance as well, and different things, installation. But in my art, I think I'm interested in examining the world around me from different aspects. Sometimes this is a more personal, a more kind of internal process, and some of it's about looking at the outside world. So in broad strokes, that's it. But I find it difficult to encapsulate like everything I've ever done in one or two sentences.
It's fine. Now I would like to know, so you said you were both in Kenya and the US. Do you feel a strong cultural background, especially when you create something?
I think it's impossible not to, like, whether you consciously feel whether you're conscious of your cultural like foundation or not, it's really, really hard not to be influenced by it. And I don't know that there's anything wrong with it either. But even if you just look at like any particular work of art, like a painting on a canvas, on a wall, this carries with it a whole tradition and idiom that is culture, and so like whatever form you're working in, you are part of a bigger tradition. Even if you are doing it in a slightly new way or something, you're still part of that tradition. I kind of believe that all art is folk art, in some aspect. So yes, I'm aware of that.
So you feel also big personal influence?
Yeah, I mean, I work. For example, my whole life I've kept sketchbooks. I keep like visual journals. This is one aspect of what I do. And then I've done a whole series of works where I worked with mnemonic associations. So I take a source information and then make these mnemonic associations and create images based off that. And that work really had a lot to do with my cultural background, the way my native language, English, of course, and the particular way I speak it, which resulted then in images. So I'm just trying to think of a quick example to give you a better idea of what that means. So I was making, for example, I made a big project about the history of New England and a particular war during that time. And in that scope, in that story, there are many Native American Algonquin words that come up. Words that some of these we are familiar with, like Massachusetts. This is an Algonquin word that means people of the Great Hill Country. But if you just hear the word Massachusetts and you don't speak any Algonquin languages, which most people don't, it has a certain sound to it. And so if I took this word Massachusetts and just interpreted it in the dumbest way possible, I thought of like a mass of chewing people sitting. So then part of the painting, there were over 100 elements, but one of the elements was this mass of people sitting on the ground chewing. And it's like this mass of chew sits represents the state of Massachusetts. And this is like about how we interpret information and how we confront things that are unknown to us through the lens of what we already know. So I would say that series of mnemonic works really had to do with my specific cultural context.
And aside from national culture, would you say that art also helps us get to know other countries around the world, other continents, and how different we are?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's like one of these non-verbal forms of communication, so it can communicate. It can just totally skip that language barrier that we often have between us. And I think if you look at the way, if you take something like graffiti art, which in the late '60s started in the Bronx, it's now nearly global. With the exception of there are some countries where it's not as represented, but it's now this phenomenon that exists all over the world. So not only do I think that yes, art can help us communicate, see our differences, but these days I actually see some coming together and it might some sense of even homogenization, greater homogenization, like the fact that you can see graffiti that follows a very particular formula in hundreds of cities across the world. It in a sense it's nice, it's like, wow, all these people share this culture, but at the same time I also think it can erode a certain local flavor. I think it can be a double-edged thing in some sense.
I actually have a perfect follow-up question for that. As an artist, do you think that culture is disappearing?
I don't think this is possible. How can culture disappear?
Or at least becoming more mixed and less prevalent, if I phrase it that way.
Yes. I mean, it's definitely in flux. But it always has been. I mean, that's what any sentence you say has, or at least in English, has influences from all these different. Part of it may be from French. Culture has always been a mixture. There's no one culture. It's all mixing together. And with things like digital platforms, it's really jarring to me how I can live in the Czech Republic and teach Czech kids, and they know songs from the 90s, pop songs from the 90s in America. It's really weird to me, and yet this is so. Yeah, I guess I'm rambling a bit.
It's fine. No.
But
go ahead.
But I don't think culture can disappear, but it changes. I mean, obviously, some people look at some things as culture and other things as not. But I think every aspect of lived life is, in some sense, culture.
It seemed like a very general question, but I want to know what inspires you most to keep going and doing what you're doing right now.
I was fortunate to be supported through my whole life, I would say, by people who recognized what I wanted to do, what I like to do, which was create in general. I enjoy not only visual arts, I also enjoy acting, even though I don't really do it anymore. Any type of expression, dancing, juggling, all these things are these are all things that I enjoy, and my whole life I was fortunate enough and privileged enough to be supported in those things. First and foremost by my family, but then also by the context in which I was living. So it's become because of these gifts that I've been given, and I'm not talking about talent, I'm talking about these opportunities and the support. It's now become part of my personality and part of my identity, and I really don't think I don't feel good when I can't make something. So that's the motivation, or that's the underlying driving force, and I really want to emphasize that debt that I owe to everybody who ever helped me, and I'm conscious of that as a teacher as well, like trying to support students as much as possible, just even if they think that they're terrible, just to, so I try to pass that on. But then on top of that, there are other like aspects of like specific aspects of human the human experience that I'm really interested in. Things like things like storytelling, the crossover between oral storytelling and visual storytelling, relationship to the landscape. I'm really interested in the Aboriginal creation myths, where you have this story of the world being created by the ancestors who rose during the dream time, who rose out of the muck and started traveling across the land, and as they traveled they sang, and their songs created the landscape, so the landscape itself can be read as a musical score, and you have these dream lines crisscrossing not only Australia but in theory the entire world, which are the song lines of the ancestors. And this connection of like this relationship of the human experience to the natural world at a really deep level is something I'm in awe of, and I wish we had more of. I can't say that I live according to this, but this, for example, this type of like strong symbolic storytelling that has a connection to a practical application of how you live your life and how you relate to the natural world, to me is like, I think that's like the highest form of art. And I am somewhat, I would love to see more. Well, I don't know if there's not enough of that, or maybe I'm not seeing it in the right way, but yeah. So that's like one thing that I'm really interested in. That's also part of my inspiration. But there are many other things. I mean, there's like, I like letters and typography and comics, and I like dabbling in things that I'm not entirely comfortable with as well, and seeing just how it turns out. But that's all within this greater context of me being lucky enough to have been supported in these endeavors.
If I can circle back, so you now teach at an international school, so you have a lot of international students. Do you see how the students interact differently with each other, being from so many different places with so many different backgrounds? And do you see that in art class, how they produce their art?
Wow, that's a tough question. It's somewhat difficult for me to answer because I've only worked as a teacher outside of or I've only worked as a teacher in these kind of international contexts.
So you don't have anything to compare?
I don't have much to compare it to, yeah. There are aspects of it that I think are perhaps, if I think back to my to going to school outside Boston in Winchester, Massachusetts, which was a very white, very affluent, in fact rather conservative environment. If I compare it to that, like people who in that environment, people who spoke English with an accent were often like made fun of. I mean, and in fact, most of the students there didn't realize that they all had accents also. Everybody has an accent. But there were certain kids who spoke English differently, and it was like a marker, right? Working in this international school, it's interesting that most of the students speak, if not 2 languages, 3 languages, 4 languages. There are very few of them who are monolingual. And even if they are, they're exposed more often to students who are speaking in a second or third language. So they're like more used to it and more accepting of it. And as a whole, I would say the atmosphere in the place I teach, perhaps it's not only a question of location but also of time, is much more accepting. And like, I don't see the type of bullying and cliques that I remember from my education. Even in an affluent, like rich context, it was quite toxic, and I don't see that here. Like, there are not distinctions between. We don't have jocks and nerds. We just have some kids who like to play sport a bit more and some kids who are more interested in other things, and I don't see them having problems with each other about this. And I absolutely love that. So that accepting aspect, my feeling is it probably does play out a little bit. It does probably influence the art classroom as well, but I don't have any. That's just a hunch. I don't have anything to back that up necessarily.
something you would like to end with? So maybe message or just thing you want to emphasize in the end?
I think this thing that I already mentioned about this notion of being part of a tradition is something that I think should be addressed more, emphasized more. I think what's somewhat sad about, for example, being able to promote yourself on social media and so on, and having these like phenomenon of like Instagram stars and especially visual art being consumed in this way. I think it's like putting too much of an emphasis on the individual, and everybody kind of wants to look like they've invented everything themselves and got to where they are entirely by themselves. And I think that is a shame, because it's not really ever the case, or rarely is it the case. So in terms of global perspectives, in terms of this idea of culture, I think this emphasis, in hip hop, there's a phrase that's often used, paying dues. Like, you got to pay your dues, and I think I like that concept, because it means that you acknowledge where you come from, you pay respect to it. Not to say you have to do it exactly the same way, but you don't act like you're the first person to ever do fill in the blank. Yeah, I think that's what I'd like to add.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I hope we provided quite an open space for you to talk and express your opinions. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.